Okay, I think we're ready to make a start. Welcome everybody to this first CHE policy forum. We've got a good number of people in the room, and I'm hoping others will be joining. And I think we have over 100 people online. If Zoom is working, as I'm sure it is. They sadly will not have the benefit of the university's excellent wine and canapes afterwards. But apart from that, they should enjoy every aspect of this particular event. Now, we've put this and two other policy forums on essentially to honour the fact that the Centre for Health Economics is 40 years old today. We're hoping actually that we continue with these policy forums into our 41st year and beyond, depending on the feedback we get from everybody. And it reflects the fact that CHE's purpose over those 40 years has primarily been to inform policy and decision-making in health systems, both here and internationally, with the purpose of improving population health and well-being. And hence, the idea is that these policy forums allow us to present some recent research that has been particularly policy focused, and for us to invite for each of them two colleagues from outside of the University of York, perhaps one with a more policy focus and the other with a more research focus, to provide some commentary on the presentations that CHE colleagues will provide. Now, then today we've got our first policy forum, which is entitled, if I can find it, Paying for Emergency Care, Why One Size Probably Doesn't Fit All. And our very own Martin Chalkley will be presenting to that title. And we have two external discussants, Anita Charlesworth, who's Director of the Research and the Real Centre. It's the Research and Economic Analysis for the Long Term at the Health Foundation, and Martin Campbell, who's Deputy Director for Payment Development at NHS England. So I'm going to ask Martin to step up and begin his presentation. You should all have the benefit of a handout for those of you in the room that provides a little bit more detail of some of the things that Martin's covering. For those colleagues online, I think we have posted, or shortly will be posting, that same handout as a Google Doc, and I hope very much you're able to download that. So I'll start with Martin, just a quick introduction. So Martin came to the Centre for Health Economics here in 2011. He came from the University of Dundee, where he'd been head of department, and whilst in Scotland, he'd served as president of the Scottish Economic Society and also played a key role in establishing the Scottish Institute for Research in Economics. His research has focused on the role of different payment mechanisms for health services, and has written both on the theory underpinning different mechanisms and the empirical evidence to support or indeed to refute that theory. In addition to academic output, Martin's also advised both government departments and professions regarding the payment mechanisms for publicly funded legal services, legal aid. Most recently, that involved providing evidence to assist Lord Bellamy's review of his criminal league aid system. Thank you, Martin. Over to you. So just to be clear, so Martin's got about 40 minutes for presentation. Each of our discussants then will have 10 to 15 minutes for their commentary, and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A subsequently. Thank you. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for your introduction. Welcome, everyone. Nice to see some faces familiar and some fresh in the audience. Yeah, so very grateful for having the opportunity of doing one of these policy forums, and actually the first policy forum And what I'm going to be talking about is some work that we have been undertaking, some research that's been undertaken, looking at payment for emergency care in the NHS in England. And as Mark said, that's a topic very close to my heart, very close to research which I've done previously, being concerned with what the impact of different ways of paying for health services are, what the implications of those are. Important to start with a disclaimer: this research, like other research under the ESHCRU programme, is funded by NIHR, but nothing I'm saying is the view of NIHR or DHSC, the sponsoring department for this. Very grateful for the funding that we received and the opportunity to engage in free thinking research, basically. You should have, if you wanted to pick one up on the way through, have a little handout. The idea behind that is it's a kind of sort of roadmap, because typically with presentations, the speaker starts and then goes down a path, and it's sometimes a little bit difficult for the audience to know where that path is, where it's reached and where it's going. So that's literally just a few notes to let you know what sections I'm going to be talking to under on this presentation. So I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to the research project itself. To set the stage, I'm going to talk a little bit about how payment has evolved for hospital services and draw attention to how emergency care, the particular focus that I'm going to be looking at, how that might differ. I'll give a whirlwind overview of how economics or economists look at these issues of payment. And then I'll get into talking about some findings from our research. I've described them there as three key findings. I thought about it afterwards. I think perhaps I would rather describe them as kind of insights from the research. And that will then lead on to saying what the implications of that are for policy, or what they could be. So let's start with the research. We work under ESHCRU, and we are a part of what's called work stream 3, organisation, incentives and regulation, and then we are a project under that called purchaser and provider contracts. And here's the team: myself, Hugh Gravel, Nikita Jacob, Rita Santos, Luigi, various people. They're in the audience here somewhere. Some of them. If you get the slides afterwards, these various greyed out things are links which you can find out more about the people, find more about ESHCRU from. So clickable links. And if you're interested to read more, we have a number of research papers, out as chain research papers. And again, these are clickable links to those papers, and read them in detail. And also, fresh off the press, as you came in, there is a kind of summary of the research, which we've called a policy briefing. And you can pick up, if you haven't picked it up already, a copy of that on the way out, which gives, I hope, a more user-friendly summary rather than having to go through the details of the research papers. Just before I talk about that, let me give you a little bit of where we came at this research from. When trying to think about ideas that it was important to explore, a new policy direction was really being set out in the NHS for the payment for emergency care. And it came under this terminology, blended payment. And I'll be honest, it immediately caught our eye as economics researchers. What is this thing called blended payment? How does it differ from what's gone before? And it became clear that blended payment was an idea really focused upon de-emphasising or moving slightly away from an exclusive focus on prices for hospital services towards suggesting payment mechanisms that, well, to use the terminology, blend that pricing system with some element of fixed payment, with that fixed payment element determined by a whole range of different factors. Mentioned there are things like quality and integration of care, of coordination, etc., as being rationales for having a larger element of fixed payment and almost by definition detracting from the traditional, or what had been up to that point, key element of payment, which is the price. So we immediately saw that and thought that's kind of interesting. What motivates it? What, as economists, would we say about the implications of that kind of movement. And that's what caused us to set up this project. And initially, that proposal for blended payment was focused upon emergency care, the sort of complement in the NHS of elective procedures in hospital. In other words, non-elective or urgent procedures within hospital, but also covering attendances at accident emergency departments when people require urgent care. So the project that suggested itself was one that focused upon emergency care, because that's where this new idea for blended payment was coming in. So let's put that a little bit in context in terms of how hospital payment systems have developed over time. I came at health economics largely because the discussion that was then very much ongoing was on the impact of this movement that had happened in America, in the US, for the Medicare system, to move away from a traditional fee-for-service model towards setting prices for hospital care that were kind of fixed and were determined by the categorization of the patient who was being treated. At the time, it was considered a pretty revolutionary move. Certainly, hospitals weren't going to be paid for precisely what procedures they undertook. They were paid a fixed price. Lots of terminology surrounded that movement. It was called a prospective payment system, to distinguish from retrospective after the event. In other words, what the hospital would get paid would be known beforehand, according to the characteristics of the patient and their disease. So it's called prospective payment system. And it then became subsequently known almost universally as DRG payment, because the categorization that was decided upon was called diagnostic related group. So once you knew a patient's DRG, it put them in a box. The box determined how much the hospitals get paid. And of course, that was revolutionary in that particular context, because up till then, patients who'd been treated under Medicare, a sort of state-funded system, had been paid whatever it was the hospital billed for them to be paying for, according to what procedures they'd undertake. So it caused a huge amount of interest. And that's where I came into health economics, thinking through what the implications of that change were. It was a system that, largely speaking, got then adopted in the NHS in England, although it was given a different name under the NHS in England. It's called payment by results. And there was a different terminology for what had been HRGs. These were called HRGs, healthcare resource groups in the English NHS. There's a clickable link there, you can find out much more. I won't go into any more detail, except to say that these systems have been rolled out across many, many jurisdictions, across Europe and now across low and middle income countries. This idea of paying for hospital services not based upon a sort of detailed bill, but according to a predetermined price schedule, is something that's been really, almost a contagion in terms of healthcare financing. So we have a lot of DRG-like systems to look at. I say here, I wanted to remind myself as much, that's pretty remarkable that there has been that kind of almost universal shift towards payment in terms of prices for hospital treatments. It's obviously caught the attention of a lot of people. It's obviously persuaded a lot of policymakers, decision makers, that this is a sensible thing to do. It begs the question, why? Why was that so very, very popular? What was it that drove that change? The original motivation in the US was undoubtedly focused upon cost and cost containment. Under the pre-existing system in the US, hospitals billed for the specific procedures and treatments that they gave. And what was observed over time is that any given medical condition seemed to experience kind of exponential growth in cost, as hospitals found more and more things that needed to be done in order to treat patients with a particular condition. So the clear motivation for this, coming from the US context, was to contain costs. And it was certainly true that, all of the early research suggested it was doing precisely that. I mean, if nothing else, once you fixed the price, you were stopping the process by which hospitals were effectively determining the prices of their treatments. But in other systems, like the English system, for example, it had a rather different kind of appeal, moving not from a sort of what is called fee-for-service arrangement, but moving from a system where budgets were set for hospitals or other healthcare providers, fixed budgets. The part of the lure of this new system was that it linked payment to activity. The more patients that got treated, the more the hospital got paid. And that was seen as a sort of clear impetus and a spur to increased activity. Since its adoption across a whole number of systems, you will find lots of other claims being made potentially for the impact of this kind of movement towards pricing systems, including that it might be an impetus to quality, although that's never really explained very easily. But it's a means and a mechanism by which all sorts of goals of the healthcare system might be achieved. So it's quite a lot to live up to, I say. This slide should have started, emergency care has been treated differently. So it's a bit mysterious. But I wanted to just draw attention to the fact that whereas DRG type systems have been applied, not universally, but increasingly and extensively for hospital services, there's always been slightly different in the case of emergency care as opposed to planned interventions. And that's certainly true if you look at the experience of the English NHS. First of all, emergency care came into that payment system a bit later. So that started to be rolled out for emergency care in 2006-07 rather than 2003-04. And then subsequent to its introduction, there have been a number of developments of the emergency care payment system that are unique to it, that haven't applied more generally. In 2010-11, there was a move towards reducing the price that was paid for emergency care, particularly for treatments outside of the expected norm. So there were changes in the actual operation. There were then changes in the conditions under which hospitals could claim further payment if patients were readmitted. So no payment for emergency readmissions from 2011-12. And then we roll forward to 2019-20, and emergency care was put forward to be the first pioneer area for trying out this blended payment system, a mixture of pricing and fixed payment. Why is there that distinction in emergency care? Well, most of those particular tweaks or changes of the system seem to be driven by the fact that actually emergency care isn't perhaps an area where we want to provide strong incentives for increased activity. And so there might be a concern that in this area, increased activity is something we want to avoid, not encourage. And there was this recognition that a pricing system potentially has the benefit in many other contexts of precisely encouraging activity. And maybe this is activity you don't really want to encourage, particularly lots and lots of people being admitted to the hospital having visited an emergency room or an emergency department. So that's by way of the background. That's where we come at this picture from. I want to say a little bit now about a sort of economic perspective on payment systems quite generally, and then we'll get to the specifics of the emergency care system and this movement towards blended payment. Economists and economics is very focused upon the incentive role of prices and payment systems, on the idea that by setting prices, you provide a kind of carrot, an incentive, a positive impetus towards doing certain things. And in that setup, the early study of DRG type systems was very much focused upon whether there would be an incentive towards controlling cost, and pretty much everybody agreed there should be. Reason for that? Well, by setting a fixed price, anything you can save by way of the producer below that fixed price is something that's available to you. You become what's called the residual claimant over any savings. So you have a strong incentive to find those savings. There was then a concern that it might result in a degradation of quality because some of those savings could come from shoddy service. But that was part of the early debate. There was, once we started to think about these systems in the context of replacing fixed budgets rather than fee for service, there was a fairly clear link between activity-based payment and an incentive towards increased activity. So those are the incentive issues, the incentive properties that economists have largely focused upon in respect to these systems. And we've got a lot of evidence potentially that's been harvested from the rollout of these systems across many different jurisdictions. Okay, always people would disagree with the interpretation of some of the evidence, but I'll go fairly strong on it and say I think there's strong evidence of reductions in the time taken to treat patients. In other words, an increased throughput of systems which are subject to these DRG type systems. And so increased activity. So they really do appear to generate increased activity. And there are very few studies that have found any convincing evidence of an impact upon quality of healthcare in either direction from the adoption of one of these systems. Quality is very problematic here, and I'll come back to it when we talk about supposed future directions, because whereas activity is something we're pretty reliable at measuring, quality of healthcare is something which is much, much more difficult. And when I say there's very little evidence, there's very little evidence because there's very little convincing measurement of quality, to be honest, in healthcare systems. So unless interventions actually actively kill people, we tend not to know very much about what the quality of care that's being given is. I would also say that the evidence, when you read it a bit more carefully, suggests there are lots of things we don't know, and that's perhaps as important as the things we do. We don't know very much, although it's been raised as a theoretical possibility. We don't know very much about what you might call displacement effects, the idea that by paying for this increased activity, you're getting less of something else. If not quality, then some kind of coordination of service or whatever. Economists call those kinds of problems under a grand name multitasking, and a multitasking problem, the fact that what you pay for in terms of incentives may displace things that you're not paid for. We don't know much about that. And there has been, in modern times, in more recent times, much concern that this focus upon financing and financial incentives might be destroying something of value in the healthcare delivery system, might be crowding out the natural tendency of healthcare professionals to worry about their patients, perhaps by being driven down the path of having to worry about the financial implications. So these are genuine concerns that exist around these sort of systems. I wanted to say a couple of things to kind of draw attention to the fact that being an economist, I'm kind of well immersed in that approach. It's not the only way that you can look at payment systems. And actually, when I was thinking about this talk, one of the things I reflected upon was this large chasm that exists between how I tend to think about payment systems, and indeed how most economists tend to think about payment systems, and how those who actually have to run healthcare systems think about these things, where primarily a big concern is very specifically financing and making sure that financial resources flow around the system. Now, that sounds obvious, but it kind of almost gets forgotten in the economics, which is all about fine-tuning things so as to get more of this or less of that. Kind of ignoring the fact that actually one of the biggest concerns within healthcare systems is to make sure there's enough money flowing to the right institutions and the right providers in order to get things done. Okay, so that's something to just bear in mind. Second thing I would kind of like to sort of draw attention to or focus upon is the idea that in the economics approach, setting of prices is really a very, very central focus. And that's a really central focus because economists regard prices almost everywhere as kind of powerful levers. So almost as soon as you started to move towards a system of financing hospitals, says we're going to pay you prices for what you do, economists leap up and think, aha, by increasing the price of this, you provide a strong incentive to do that activity or some other activity. But economists really do focus in upon the role of these prices as potential levers of changes of things. The last thing might sound a little bit random at this point, but I also wanted to mention, because I'll come back to it under policy implications. There is a strand of economics which I only recently began to read very much about, which I think is important, particularly in the context of the way in which the NHS is going, which is, you know, if you are going to have a system of prices, should those prices be determined somehow centrally, or should you leave it to the constituent parts of the system to figure out what the prices should be? Particularly when you've got a large, you know, healthcare system with many different regions. Should price setting be a centralised matter, or should it be a decentralised matter? Should it be delegated? Actually, there's quite a strong tradition in the context of this kind of setting of thinking that actual centralised setting, where there are certain goals of the system as a whole that would otherwise be lost, centralised setting of pricing is really quite important. So I'm just going to mention that because I'll come back to it. Okay, now, whirlwind tour of our research. So this is why I put those notes, because I think it might be useful to refer back, see what it is I'm talking about, because otherwise it's going to come as a bit of a rush, but here we go. When we start to think about this issue of emergency care, one thing stood out almost straight away, and I mean, this is the importance of actually having engagement, which is possible through ESHGRI with policy colleagues and decision makers, because I was setting down off one particular path, my economist path, of saying, well, changing the price of emergency care will affect activity in the hospital, and in particular, admissions that we could expect to see following people contacting the hospital. That seems to be the most obvious mechanism. And it was almost immediately pointed out to me, one of the concerns in the system, though, is that that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is how many people turn up at hospital in the first place? How many people attend A&E departments? And I had, you know, a representative of a hospital provider tell me exactly this. Our concern is if you reduce the price that the purchaser of services has to pay for hospital admissions, they have a much weaker incentive to stop people coming to hospital. In other words, they may not invest in community services that would otherwise stop people appearing as emergencies. And that was sort of a bit of a sort of light bulb moment. That seemed like something very important. Might seem kind of obvious, but suddenly it's something which the economic models hadn't really thought about. There are two kinds of decisions going on here: community-based decisions and hospital-based decisions. But both of those decisions may depend upon the price you set for the hospital. Ooh, that's quite important, okay, because it says this question of incentives is a bit more tricky and a bit more subtle than you might initially think. There are two things to keep an eye on. Two, if you like, dimensions of the system. What's driving people to hospital in the first place, how they get converted from appearing in the outpatient or in the emergency room to being treated as inpatients in the hospital. And we set out to construct an economic model, a theoretical construct, to try and understand that interplay, the potential interdependency of these two facets of emergency care: attendance at A&E and admission to the hospital, and how both of those things might be influenced by prices, with particularly the goal of thinking, suppose you choose to reduce the role of prices, reduce those prices, what's going to happen? That's what we tried to do. Ambitiously, because it's like a 50-page theoretical paper, I'll try and do it in two very simple diagrams. Now, those of you who studied economics before, you'll love this. Those of you who haven't will probably wonder what on earth is going on about. For those who've studied economics before, you may remember in the dark distant past being taught about the Corno model of duopoly, and how what one firm wants to do depends upon what the other firm does, and what the other firm does depends upon what the first firm wants to do. And this is a problem of trying to resolve interdependency. And that same mechanism kind of works here. What we have managed to establish is that there is a natural interdependency in the decisions that give rise to, on the horizontal axis here, what hospitals do, the proportion of patients that are admitted, and on the vertical axis here, something that might be influenced by what purchasers of healthcare, the CCGs in the English system, do, and that's the proportion of their population that's going to attend an emergency department. So how can they affect that vertical axis? Well, they can ensure better community services, they can give alternative pathways for people seeking urgent care, or they can curtail those activities, and according to whether they do one or the other, that line goes up and down. And what it suggests is, what either of these two players in this system, the purchaser of services, which is investing in out-of-hospital care, and the hospital, which is making decisions about admitting patients, what both of those want to do depends upon what the other's doing. And that's captured in a diagram by supposing we have some sort of trade-off or line, such that for the red one here, it's supposedly the hospital's best choice of what to do in terms of admissions, given what it's observing the community, the CCG doing in terms of attendances, and vice versa for this blue line. It's a framework for understanding how things will resolve when everything looks a bit complicated. And it resolves diagrammatically by saying what we're looking for is an intersection between these two choice lines, if you like, of the two players in the system. And that's kind of important and interesting because as we change anything, the context of the system, potentially both of those things shift around. And in fact, both of those things certainly shift around if we change the way in which hospital services are paid for. So we now have a framework for beginning to think about, okay, what's going on here and how does it resolve? And we have a model that helps us, guides us, it tells us, you know, if something in the system changes such that that red line shifts out, we expect to see an intersection move from there to there. Well, that's more patients admitted, and we've gone down a little bit over there, so fewer patients or fewer people attending hospital. We can figure it out. And when we do that, for the case of a shift to a blended payment, if we interpret blended payment as a kind of reduction in the emphasis upon prices, then we get this kind of shift. Both of those red and blue curves shift, in fact. So we start there, and then I say, suppose we reduce prices for hospital admissions. Hospitals want to admit fewer patients, so which one is it? The red line shifts down towards fewer admissions. Given that, and given the fact that it now has to pay a lower price for people going to hospital, CCG wants to reduce whatever effort it puts into reducing attendances. So the two things together kind of suggest that we move from a position which was an intersection down here somewhere to an intersection up there. And you have to be careful then, because, you know, that's not unambiguously a good thing, is it? I mean, we've reduced hospital admissions, but we've increased the number of people who attend hospital. So emergency departments, which we know already have ambulances queuing outside, etc., are going to get busier, just as the proportion of patients that are actually attending is going to be reduced. That's our sort of framework for beginning to think about the impact of the blended payment. Full details worked out, lots of different examples given of how we can use that framework or in the various publications. We're going to go into those now. What I'm going to now focus upon to get us moving towards the policy implications is, okay, we have an economic model, so what? One of the uses of an economic model such as this is to give you a way of thinking about what you should be focused upon in terms of data. And what this model begins to suggest is you don't want to focus exclusively upon admissions into hospital, you want to focus on both attendances and admissions. And when you start thinking like that, this economic model, by the way, this diagram is drawn on the basis of a single hospital and a single CCG, or a single purchaser of hospital services. Of course, out there in the world, we've got lots of these things. They may differ very considerably. So one question is, how much do they differ? Because if you step back one little step, if you expect changing the payment system to affect things, what is there to be affected and how variable is what is there to be affected? That's the next question that we set about looking at. And we come to the conclusion there's a lot of variation, and there is a lot of variation in both the proportion of patients that are admitted and in the proportion of population that attends hospital. Let's smoothly and quickly move things along. For example, this is a sort of traditional kind of diagram that you often see to display variation. What I've done, what's been done here, I say the team did, is to look at hospitals and rank them according to what proportion of patients they admitted. So look at the scale here. At this low end of low admitting hospitals, we're around about 10, 15%, or 15% to 20%. At the top end, we're up to 40%. Well, you might say that's no surprise. Hospitals are very different, they're treating very different patients. This is after we've accounted for the different characteristics of the patients that the hospitals treat. So this is what in the jargon is called after risk adjustment. Incidentally, these usual whisker type plots give you some notion of the degree of variability or uncertainty about these points. But we're looking at individual patient level data here and grouping it to hospitals. So we've got a lot of observations. So there's not very much variation there. These are statistically significant differences almost across the board. And, you know, scale really is important here. 15 to 40, it's 2.5 to 3 times from the lowest to highest after you've accounted for patient characteristics. I actually say patient characteristics, but we throw a whole load more in here as well. We actually control for something approaching the conditions of local supply of out-of-hospital services as well. So we're taking account of whether these are hospitals that operate in an area where there are fewer or more GPs, whether those GPs are more or less open, and so on and so forth. And none of it changes this picture. You know, there is a big, big difference. That's one thing. What about the other dimension? What about when we then look at how many people are attending any departments? Well, the vertical lines get bigger here because we haven't got such a detailed level of information. But this is doing the same exercise, only now we're ranking the purchasers within the NHS England system, the CCGs, and we're looking at the proportion of their populations that attend accident emergency. Again, we're correcting for the population characteristics, and we throw in a whole load of other correction factors as well, best we can. So these are risk adjusted. And again, the scale is worth looking at. I mean, over to the left-hand side here, these low-ranked CCGs, 15% population attends accident emergency in a year. And incidentally, that doesn't mean 15% of people attend. One of the characteristics of attendance at emergency departments is it's the same people that keep going back and back and back. But okay, this is nevertheless the propensity for attendance. You know, 15 to 20%, up to 35, 40. And I think that is pause for thought. If you're thinking about changing a payment system, and if you think the payment system is going to have an impact upon what's going on, well, these are very different systems that you're potentially impacting upon. Of course, we can do nice things like, you know, show that these are not equally dispersed across the country. And, you know, this is looking at that last graph, not just ranking from low to high, but looking for high as dark colours, low is light blue colours. And we can see that there are areas of the country which are much different from others, where there are, you know, really high concentrations of this use of emergency departments. And then when we put the two things together, it's also quite interesting. Now, that's not always easy to do because often the case that one hospital serves several CCGs and one CCG uses many hospitals. But if we restrict attention to where there's almost a one-to-one correspondence between a CCG and the hospital that it uses, you get this kind of picture, which is a bit of a shotgun. But what it's saying is up here, there are areas of the country which have both high attendance and high admission. So these are running really hot in terms of their emergency care systems. And again, it begs the question, if you're going to change things in this system as a whole, do you want to be doing it everywhere for the same? Or do you want to be focusing upon areas? So that leads nicely into the last thing I want to really open up for discussion. So I'm going to speak less here and invite the discussants and generally audience participation on this. These are just the key things which I think you might draw from what I've said in terms of policy implications. We know the NHS is on this path to reduce the role of prices. It's now proposing to do it beyond emergency care. We've got a lot of theory and a lot of evidence that says changing prices does things, it affects things. And we've discovered when we've looked at this in detail in emergency care that it's greatly complicated by the fact that there are multiple decision makers making multiple decisions that are affected by these prices. So it's at least pause for thought about what the incentive properties of this system are. We know from our evidence there's big differences between different local areas in terms of these both dimensions of performance. So one thing I would immediately plea for is if this system is being rolled out, that we have central reporting of local pricing agreements, because as we go forward, we want to know who's doing what and what impact it's going to have. Certainly, because there's a lot of regional dispersion, a lot of a more local approach seems to be warranted. But I want to sort of jump on my soapbox a little bit. There is nothing in the theory or the evidence suggests you want to be putting necessarily less emphasis upon prices. And in some areas, it might be important to put a lot more emphasis upon prices. So blended payment may not be the same everywhere you look at it. And there is this fundamental question of, when you talk about local variation, are you going to allow the local players to determine what goes on in terms of prices, or are you going to admit that there isn't one price fits all, but that the prices are set centrally? I want to end by saying thank you. First of all, I don't want to end this without sort of thanking Eschgrew more generally. We have Anne, where's Anne? Sitting in the audience, our director, who has been a huge support throughout all of this. So big thanks to Anne, and she is ably supported by Louise, who also keeps us wonderfully in line. And Eschgrew isn't just a group of researchers, it's a whole bunch of people who contribute. Policy colleagues, decision makers, patient and public involvement, all of influence research. So a big thank you to all of those. A thank you to our funder. And thank you to Che for employing me.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thanks for sticking to time as well. A couple of things I should have mentioned earlier. Firstly, I should introduce myself, Mark Scolford, I'm current director of Che. Secondly, obviously in the audience, please store up the questions to the end. Those of you online, you're very welcome to use the question button on Zoom to put any of your questions in there. There is a facility for people to uprate or I guess downrate them. So we get some idea of popularity of those questions. So our first discussant is Anita Charlesworth. So she's Director of Research at the Real Centre at the Health Foundation. She's also Honorary Professor at the Health Services Management Centre in Birmingham. She's a health economist, has a background in government and public policy. And before joining the Health Foundation in 2014, Anita was Chief Economist at the Nuffield Trust. And prior to that, she had roles as Chief Analyst and Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and Director of Public Spending at the Treasury from 1998 to 2007. She's worked as an economic advisor at the Department of Health and for SmithKline Beecham Pharmaceuticals. Thank you very much for joining us today, Anita. Over to you.
So, happy birthday to Che. It's wonderful to be in York because 35 years ago this month I started my master's in health economics here, and I owe such a debt of gratitude to York and everyone who taught on that masters for an incredibly stimulating career. The thing I'm going to talk about is what some of the issues are that have arisen in the use of the payment system, and try and draw out, I think, then some of the economic issues that underlie that. And I think just to start with, as Martin said, when payment systems were introduced payment by result system were introduced in the English NHS, they were part of a whole programme of quasi-market reforms, very focused around choice and competition, and a set of provider incentives and autonomous providers that were designed, obviously, as part of that, to change and sharpen the incentive structure facing providers in the NHS, and to create commissioners. But when that was done, was I think a recognition, and Andy Street talks about this quite a bit, that actually we'd got services like planned care where we were trying to inject competition, but we got services like emergency care, which are more like local natural monopolies. And there actually we were borrowing some of the ideas from regulated monopolies, gas, water, particularly water, electricity, and trying to introduce yardstick competition. So it's quite important when we think about the payment system that in different parts of the system, in different types of healthcare services, in some cases, the payment by results systems was part of a suite of reforms to really support actual competition. And in other parts, they were part of a suite of reforms which were trying to use more monopoly style economic regulatory tools. Yeah, and so some of the things which are quite interesting are thinking about how to do that. The other thing which is really important, and I think at the beginning of the payment system was underemphasized, to pick up on something that Martin said, was, I mean, you describe it as financing, I describe it as resource allocation. The payment system is doing two things simultaneously. Both those things really matter. It is a way of moving money around our system to where it is needed. Yeah, so we have a resource allocation system based on need that goes to the Commissioner of Healthcare, and then we need a way of transmitting that money on to the providers of healthcare based on where it's needed. So some of what motivated a lot of European countries to introduce DRG systems was transparency and accountability to support that resource allocation, not so much ideas of economic incentives. In countries that were experimenting with quasi-market models, obviously that's more the case. So that resource allocation really matters. Resource allocation matters for the effectiveness of policy, but the other thing that matters within resource allocation is the level at which you set the price. So my understanding, and Martin will know this much better than me, is that the incentives you get if you set a price above or below the efficient cost of delivering quality of care are very different. So essentially, if you set a price at which anyone doing their job properly will lose money, the incentive properties of that are very different to setting a price at which doing your job efficiently allows you to make a margin. You know, that's kind of basic economics. So the level of the price matters a lot. And we introduced this at the beginning in a period of quasi-market reforms with huge expansion in the NHS funding, but actually then carried it on in a period where then funding was highly constrained and funding growth was highly constrained, and the payment by results system then became very focused on an efficiency target, and you were borrowing actually from the kind of regulatory RPI minus X kind of model of where X is your assumption about efficiency and bearing down hard on that. What we've seen then, I think, is three issues that really now, through this period, are quite fundamental issues that we need to think about in terms of this next phase of design of the payment system. So the first one is, how well does the money align with the cost of providing the care? And what we've seen is enduring deficits and surpluses, and the increasing use, because this is a public sector system then, of funny money, of billions of pounds actually going in to undermine our official resource allocations and bail people out, which reduces the incentives and reduces transparency. Now, I would argue this is partly to do with the extent to which policy making at the time was really unrealistic in the scale of the efficiency factor that it was setting, but also it potentially raises a bigger question for the economics. Because in a way, the theory of both the yardstick and the genuine sort of quasi-market competition is that if you set a price based on the average cost across the system of delivering high quality care, yeah, in essence, all providers can reach that. And we set something called a market forces factor to recognise there are some things that are beyond the scope, you know, of individual providers. You know, property values vary across the country, land values. But actually, in a system which is aiming to deliver comprehensive coverage with a requirement for access, where capital markets are riddled with market failure in the NHS, one of the challenges is, I think, is that we do have quite high fixed costs that represent legacy issues, that represent political issues, that reflect wider social goals around things like access. And the extent to which we're able to adjust for those fixed costs is quite important, because if you don't, you get windfall losses and windfall gains, yeah? And you get some people for whom this is never an efficiency incentive because they're losing so much money and getting bailed out, it's all frankly irrelevant. And other people who aren't worried at all about improving the efficiency of the services because they're making lovely windfall gains and wondering about how to invest in new shiny facilities and buy another bit of kit. So how to deal with the fixed costs, I think, is a genuinely important issue. How far we think there is that, and it links partly as well to some of the incentives and the time frame over which we do this. We've introduced payment by results in the English NHS in a we do set prices annually, and we restructure the payments repeatedly. Now, you know, incentive effects generally take time, and where you've got a lot of fixed assets or semi-fixed costs, it also takes time to shift the service. So I would argue that's a problem. The other thing which I think is quite important then is that capital market point. Yeah, so if there are opportunities to improve efficiency, quite often they require a capital investment to unlock an efficiency gain. So the extent to which capital market is functioning effectively is important, but also by and large those effects aren't simultaneous. You know, so you invest in the capital, it takes a little bit of time. You need confidence that the incentive regime is going to stay the same, and an ability to be confident in your financing. The second thing is we don't pay for resilience. So in this model, and this is brought into sharp relief, I think, in COVID, we're paying for consumption. Yeah, so we're paying for when we use assets. But some of what we want, particularly when you think about emergency services, is a service which is there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is of a standard of quality consistently across all of that time. Yeah? So we want to pay for resilience, an existence value alongside a use value. And we've seen that in particular because we might also want to ensure that we've paid for some resilience to ups and downs seasonally and health shocks. How much is a policy question, but we do definitely have a value from resilience, which at the moment, so we have an output we are not pricing and we're not paying for. And I think that's almost certainly proved to be problematic. The other issue we've got is one of allocative efficiency, and I think Martin's work and this understanding in particular of this issue about the incentives that you provide to essentially turn up at A&E and the incentives to admit a really interesting example of that. So we're trying to think within this about allocative efficiency. A lot of the criticism of payment by results is that they're not very good in terms of allocative efficiency properties. Again, timescale, I think, matters for that. Annuality is really important. Transitional funding and dual funding is really important. So how do you exit sunk costs that you've got, and how do you invest setup costs is really important. If you've got capital market failures, that's problematic. And how do you develop payment systems beyond the acute sector that try to essentially incentivize shared ownership of this of some of these problems, and optimum allocation of resource across a pathway? And we've got real challenges there with a hard funding border between primary care, public health, and social care. So I do think that a blended payment is almost certainly, faced with that reality and that set of ambitions, really important. But I conceptualize a blended payment rather differently to the way I think the NHS is currently conceptualizing that. And I'll just fix with that. I think what's really important in thinking about a blended payment is the extent to which we need to pay for some of this resilience. We need to pay to reflect some of the fixed and sunk costs, and the extent to which we're able to provide an incentive framework that operates over longer time frames, so that people can invest to improve productivity and have incentives to do that. The other thing that I think is really important is to think through not just how do we set a payment system in the queue, but how do we really start to create a payment system for community, primary care, and those other services. Because part of the problem that Martin talks about is reflective of the fact that actually for community health services, what we've got is a fixed budget. So actually they're not incentivized at all to expand activity, to respond and to support that shift of care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita. So our second discussant sadly has come down with a lurgy, but he's well enough, thankfully, to be able to present from the comfort of his home. So I'm going to hand over to Martin. We'll get him up on the screen in a sec, just to give you a little bit more detail about Martin Campbell. He's Deputy Director for Payment Development at NHS England. So he's held a number of senior finance roles in NHS England and the Department of Health. He led the Department of Health team that coordinated the spending review bids for the NHS and for adult social care. He was also responsible for reviewing the PCT allocation formula, including the market forces factor. For the last few years, he has worked on the tariff, first as head of the payment by results development team in the Department of Health, responsible for the design of the tariff, including the introduction of best practice tariffs, and then as head of pricing in NHS England, where he leads NHS England's responsibilities for the national tariff, working alongside NHS improvement. So Martin, thank you very much. I hope you can hear us. If you just ask to advance the slides, then I'll do so on your behalf.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, if you could just put the first slide up, please, that would be great. Apologies again that I can't be with you this evening. I'm particularly missing out on the university's wine and canapes, so I'm really disappointed to do that. But thanks for the invite to respond to the really interesting research that Martin outlined and Anita responded to. So if you could just go on a couple more slides, I think.
We're just getting things straight here.
It's okay. So what I'm gonna try and do is just do a very quick sort of history of paying for emergency care from a policy viewpoint, and try and sort of explain where we've ended up with at the moment in terms of how we're paying for emergency care, and look at where we are at the moment and the rationale for that, and then just to finish off with a bit of a look forward to see where we may be going for paying for emergency care in the future and the potential challenges for that, picking up on some of the issues that both Martin and Anita have set out. So I'll try not repeat what people have said before, but a bit of history of how we're paying for emergency care. obviously before PBR, it's a set of fixed payments. When we introduced payment by results, really sort of interesting to note that was during a period of historically quite generous financial settlements compared to where we are at the moment when we introduced payment by results for both elective and emergency care. Then we went, given that period of financial austerity that we went through, and as Anita said, very, very sort of ambitious efficiency assumptions in the annual prices. What happened was that actually providers and commissioners voted with their feet and moved away locally from the payment by results model to much more of a fixed payment for both emergency and elective care. So even before the NHS long-term plan, probably more than half the country had already moved away from PBR to something that looked like a sort of fixed or some sort of risk sharing arrangements. And then the NHS long-term plan set out the sort of future direction of travel for payment systems. And then much more recently, with a change in legislation, a change to the name that gives us a bit more flexibility in the in how we can set prices and rules for paying for emergency care. So yeah, so the NHS long-term plan just set out generally that move away from activity-based payments to a blended payment, recognizing that at least initially we would probably still want to have volume-based payments for some services, but we did make that initial move away from activity-based payments to what we described as a blended model, which was a mix of a fixed and a variable payment for urgent emergency care in particular, and then with the pandemic, the whole system paused and we moved to a series of emergency payment arrangements, and that really sort of enabled us to move that blended payment model sort of forward to covering all services. So again, this is just the sort of variation of the blended payment model that we use at the moment. And I think it's also worth considering that the other issue that the payment by results had was it in some systems it was creating a lot of tension between providers and commissioners, with commissioners feeling that providers were sometimes overbilling for activity and causing financial problems for the commissioner, and it wasn't generally, some people felt it wasn't aligned with achieving their local objectives. So having that reduction in bureaucracy by moving away from payment activity to a slightly simpler fixed payment model was one of the objectives we had, recognizing we would probably still need some volume-based payments for some services such as electives and for some items that were on a fee-for-service basis, and then also there may be some risk-sharing elements locally that people would want to implement, and we've also got some quality incentives that we have at the moment, such as sequin and payment by results. So that was within the sort of the overall sort of design of blended payment that that forms the basis of the current payment system. So so at the moment, there's so paying for emergency care, we've moved to a block payment for emergency care, and there's very little appetite at the moment to move back towards a payment by activity model for emergency care, unlike what we've done for elective care, where we have moved back to a payment by activity model. And I think the rationale for that is a couple of things. One is we don't think there's an incentive at the moment, particularly the very, very tight financial incentives, to provide that potential incentive for providers to increase activity, but also having a fixed payment hopefully should provide a much better framework for providers and commissioners to work together to make the best uses of resources they've got within their system. But what we want to try and avoid is actually that rather than providers and commissioners just rolling over that historic block payment that potentially builds in inefficiencies into the payment for services, actually, how can we get providers and commissioners to work together to make sure that the payment is based on the efficient cost of delivering services, the best use of resources for the system as a whole? And we're starting to make use of some of the new patient level costing information that's becoming available to produce some products that should enable systems to benchmark costs by providers and within providers to try and identify areas where they can potentially make changes to the payment to achieve those allocative efficiency savings that we're looking for. I think, as Anita said, we also keen to make progress on developing payments for mental health and community services. These have been on sorts of simple block contracts even during the period of payment by results for acute services, hampered by a lack of quality of activity and of standardized ways of counting and coding the services. So we are adopting standardized currencies for mental health and community services, and hoping to use those as the basis of slightly more sophisticated payment models for mental health and community services, not recognizing the sort of significant difficulties that have in moving away from that. But actually, within the context of emergency care, actually looking at the whole emergency care pathway, if we're sort of serious around wanting to keep people out of hospital, then we do obviously need to look at the payment model for out of hospital emergency care, as well as just concentrating on the payment model for emergency care, and having some sort of volume-based payment for some services within mental health and community services may be the right way forward. I also mentioned that we've got the sort of Sequin and payment by results at the moment. We provide some micro quality, financial quality incentives. So we're planning to pause Sequin next year at the moment to do a bit of a wider review of quality incentives to see where we want to go more generally on quality incentives. So that's the sort of general approach of payment for specifically a more general emergency care. The sort of challenges associated with that, as I said, is I think there's a significant risk that, particularly in a time of particularly financial constraint, the providers and commissioners just roll forward the previous fixed payment adjusted by efficiency and inflation, without having a more sort of informed approach in terms of what the level of payment should be for each provider commissioner relationship. There's also maybe a significant lack of capacity within providers and commissioners to implement new payment models for non-acute services, which means there's a risk that we would continue with those simple block contracts. And actually, there may be also a risk that if we're not able to do those things, then the payment models will not align to support the system working that we are looking for. So we're in quite an interesting time, I think, at the moment in payment systems more generally, and particularly for emergency care, is moving away from the emergency payment approaches that we took during the pandemic, trying to move to more sophisticated the blended payment approach, and trying to use some more products to inform those payment systems between providers and commissioners, and at the time trying to shift away from the simple block contracts from mental health and community services. And just finally, one other thing is we're sort of working with the NHS Confederation, looking at some examples of best practice payment systems across the NHS and internationally, following the sort of recommendations in the Hewitt review for some systems to potentially try out some different payment models. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. And now we've got a good 20 minutes to have a Q&A. So we've got the opportunity to ask questions from the floor. I'd encourage colleagues online to post their questions as well. Let me just kick. Anita, can I suggest you come and sit here? We've got Martin on screen. I think we could probably maximise that, Steve. So Martin talked about building quality to incentives. You mentioned Sequin one and so on. And I just wondered whether you have views about the success of the likely success of that. Listen to you, Martin. You didn't talk much about quality and what I would call outcomes. Is it the holy grail that can never be really factored into payment mechanism?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, in this world for an awful long time now, it seems. I started working on this in sort of like 1998. And I mean, in all of that time, you know, quality is kind of like a mantra that's talked about in relation to healthcare. So, oh, we must have systems that incentivize quality. But the truth is, you know, we have so few credible measures of quality. And I just help, whenever I see discussion of payment systems that say, moving forward, we're going to have a greater emphasis upon quality of services and that we're going to incentivize quality of services, the question that just comes to mind is how? What is it you're going to measure? And I like to kind of, you know, contrast that with, you know, we have enough trouble with something nice and straightforward like activity levels sometimes in terms of measurement, without talking about esoteric things such as quality, which can be many dimensioned. And the other point of economics that comes to my head whenever that gets mentioned is, if ever there was an issue of multitasking, if you recall that notion I said earlier on about crowding out of certain kinds of objectives, then that seems to really apply in the domain of quality. That you go out and measure something and say, right, we're only going to pay you if you deliver on that. What 100 other things are not being done that you are going to sacrifice through doing that? So I just find, I must admit, you know, a huge gap between the aspiration and what's deliverable whenever it comes to this work quality, which causes me to go back to what I'm most familiar with. You know, we know something about how activity-based systems work. We know something about the incentives. We know how to measure. We can, you know, measure performance against those. So I think that's my mantra on quality.
Okay. Did you want anything on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think a few things. We've actually got a bit backwards on the measurement thing, because obviously, I mean, not for emergency, but we did have patient-reported outcome measures with an aim actually really to start to improve some of the data on that, and they seem to have gone into abeyance. But even if you solve the measurement challenge, you've got the attribution challenge. You know, so to what I mean, especially most outcomes are the result of pathways of care and a complex interaction between what the system's done, you know, the underlying nature of the condition and socio-economic context. You know, so actually designing, and there are lots of schemes in the US, weren't there, to try to pay for quality as part of all the accountable care. And they've fallen totally in the attribution and the fact that you've got joint production costs and joint outputs. And I personally, I can't work my way around that. In a more, the other thing you've got is what's the incentive effects of withholds. So in the UK, we've been deploying actually withholds. So sequin is not an extra payment for quality. It's some of the pay prices are theoretically held back. Yeah, unless you deliver and meet quality standards. But and the QOF experience as well. If you pick partial measures of quality, to what extent actually have you increased quality, or have you just led to the displacement effect that you talked about earlier on, and the focus on what's measurable? And obviously, in something as complicated as healthcare, that's a really big worry. One chink of light in this, though, is that we did have best practice tariffs, which were not payment for quality so much as a whole, trying to change the payment system to align with what medically was understood to be good quality care, quite often about designing processes, and then linking the payment system essentially to support in resource allocation terms and incentivize people then to introduce that. So that was almost like using the payment system not to pay for quality, but to stimulate and support the adoption of things which were well understood and agreed to be associated with quality. That sort of model, and I think it's a shame that we haven't gone further with best practice tariffs, did seem an example of where you could potentially use the payment system in support of well understood and clinically recognised quality enhancing process change.
Thank you. Martin Campbell, anything you want to add on that? You've been very close to some of this stuff.
Yeah, just on the best practice tariff stuff, I'll agree with both what Martin and Anita said, but particularly on the best practice tariff stuff, what we found was actually that where there's a clear process that leads to better quality, then that's where the sort of best practice tariff model really worked, because you've got the clear attribution. And actually what we found is actually it was less of the, I think, less of the financial incentive that was providing the difference, and more almost that the added profile that that financial element led to it. So that, alongside other things, seemed to raise the profile along most clinicians and hospital managers, and seems to have made a difference to the quality in some relatively narrow areas, but potentially that could be rolled out for some others in the future where we can find those similar models. But on the sequin, I mean, that's another area where people sort of voted with their feet and essentially ignored the sequin elements, and commissioners just passed the money on to providers without worrying whether they met the criteria or not.
Thank you. Nick, do you want to just say any questions on the floor, who you are?
Thank you very much, Mark, for convening these 3 sessions. And I think I'm the only person here who was a 1983 recruit to the Centre of Health Economics. Alan was there, and I was the first person to be recruited by him. And with Brenda Leese, we did, in fact, a book on family doctors and economic incentives, which was the first volume to deal with those issues.
Just remind the folk of your name.
Nick Bosanquet, retired professor of health policy from Imperial College and currently co-partner in a new consultancy aiming for health success, which has a message of how can we do more with what we've got. Because although I am a great admirer of Anita, I don't think there's going to be a lot more money and a lot more staff in the next 10 years. So the question is, how do we improve A&E? And there is a background factor of these discussions on payment systems, which is public concern about the quality of A&E is falling disastrously with these higher waiting times and also poor access to doctors within the system. So we've got to look at ways of improving the quality, because I think by and large the quality is falling a great deal. And one way, we should go to Blackpool, which funnily enough has done more to reduce waiting times than almost anywhere in the country. What they've done is identify the people who are coming to A&E once a week and given them health mentors, coaches, so that they don't come to A&E, that if necessary, they go to see their GPs, they go and see their coach, and they have some of the shortest waiting times in the north of England, and in fact, in the whole UK. So that's one area that perhaps we can move forward, because I hope CHE will be looking at positive solutions always in the next year or two. The other area is how do we develop community services in which people have confidence, which will stop them going to A&E unnecessarily. 40% of the people who go to A&E have no actual medical problem. They need reassurance. And they are blocking access for people who do need a lot of A&E. So how are we going to provide better services for people with long-term conditions affected by exacerbations? There's just been a good survey today of how primary care doesn't have the equipment and skills to do measurement of respiratory problems. FEV it's called. And as a result, when they get exacerbations, they have great breathing problems, they're all into A&E and then into emergency admissions. So there are some simple, low-cost ways of improving quality in A&E, which your data can help with designing. And I should say finally that I'm certainly the only person here who knew Professor Thompson of Yale, who started the DRG thing, and I've had lunch with him at Yale. But where are the short, low-cost solutions which are going to stop this sad decline in quality?
do either our discussants or Martin Chalkley want to come back on any of those?
I want to raise one thing, which is, I think, quite important. I think all the issue of how you get the right mix of investment and mix of services for allocative efficiency across pathways is really, really important. Really, really, really important. And actually, sort of, we can over rely on payment systems and incentives, because you kind of part of the reliance on incentives. You assume people know what the answer is, and they just and to quote my kids, they see the ad, you know, and so you need to sway them. In a lot of times, really understanding. I don't think that's the primary issue, and understanding a bit like we did with best practice tariffs, how you do a combination of incentivizing, allow the money to flow, so using the payment system as a resource allocation thing, understanding what that profile is, and also then helping people around best practice tariffs. There was training, there was clinical guidance, so you made it possible. And I think that suite of, thinking about that intelligent suite of interventions that allows that adoption to happen is really important. However, I would say, actually, I am quite worried about the movement away from PBR increasingly coming out of the pandemic, and the idea of sticking with these fixed budgets that seem very, very entrenched in our system, because we come out of the pandemic with an absolute productivity crisis in healthcare. So we have got, you know, more than 10% more staff, and activity still not recovered. Now there are, you know, a number of reasons for that. But actually, it is sort of suggesting to me as well, it's a reminder that fixed budgets are bad. Yeah, the incentive properties of fixed budgets are awful. And actually, that's been part of the problem for mental health and community health services. The incentive properties of relying exclusively on fixed budgets, I think, are awful. And the post-COVID experience reminds us of that.
Well, let me just throw in a quick question we had online from Thomas Mason, who's very complimentary about the presentations, and then he asks the degree to which the delivery of same-day emergency care is impacting payment mechanisms, and whether changes associated with the COVID-19 pandemic provide new insights to how payment mechanisms impact care delivery. So that's one. I'm going to let Peter also chime in with a question, if I may, and then perhaps we can reflect on these in the round. Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Sibby from Centre Health Economics as well. So my comment was just on the role of sort of the new policy, or relatively new policy initiative of integrated care and integrated care systems, and how that interacts with, for example, Martin's model, where the CCGs and the providers play this sort of non-cooperative game on the attendances and the admissions. I suppose, is the idea of integrated care and the new replacements for CCGs that would sort of mitigate some of those problems of, the purchasers and providers sort of not cooperating sufficiently, and how could that even change your equilibrium there? Could if the purchasers and providers could sort of cooperate better?
Okay, so reflect on those. The two questions, one online from Thomas and Peter.
I'll start with can I chip in on the second one? I mean, the integrated care system thing. I'm struck by the fact that just simply changing the label on the box doesn't actually change necessarily what goes on within the box. And I think one of the dangers is that these new kind of systems will still have the same kinds of tensions as the old kind of system. It's still, at the end of the day, about carving up resources. And I think, depending upon which system you're looking at, that may have different outcomes. I suppose from an economic perspective, you'd be thinking about what the relative bargaining power within that new structure is, who is in the best position to appropriate the budget to fit their own particular goals and objectives. So I mean, I don't say it doesn't do anything, but I think it, there is a risk that you do just reinvent the same problems in a different kind of structure. There's something else I just wanted to pick on because I thought it was really kind of interesting. It's just something that I think cuts across quite a lot of these issues. One of the things I kind of suddenly got to thinking about when constructing that model I talked about was the idea that when you come to incentives, it's not only who receives the money, it's who pays it that's really important, because the feature of our model is if it's CCGs that pay this money out of their budget for hospital care, there are incentive properties on the CCGs of those payments. And I don't think that's something that's really been kind of sort of thought about, you know, tremendously much within the system, but it's actually very important because in many of these talks about, you know, cutting back on these variable payments, what you're doing is insulating the payer from those activity risks. Now, that might be a good thing, but it might be a very bad thing. I mean, one of the features of our model is that it kind of illustrates there may be an unintended bad consequence of that. By insulating them from the consequences of people turning up in hospital, they might have a lower incentive. So it's just something to keep in mind, I think.
Thank you. Martin, Campbell, anything you want to respond to those questions and the comments we've had from Martin?
No, I agree that that's the risk is just changing the names doesn't change the behaviours of the people taking part. But actually, the potential difference could be that if the way that systems are managed and the way that their performance is assessed, if it's taken across the whole of the system, so including commissioners and providers together, then that potentially will help bind the individual organizations into what's best for the system as a whole rather than individual organizations. But I completely agree that's still dependent on the individuals and individual organizations wanting to behave in a system way rather than thinking about their own individual organization. Yeah.
Two thoughts from me. On that point, one of the things that's happening at the same time as we've got the move to ICSs is providers are organising into collaboratives. Yeah, so providers are coming together into groupings, and so then integrated care systems. I'm on the board of North West London. Are then interacting with these collaboratives, but the collaboratives across most of the country are being organised again as acute collaboratives and community and mental health collaboratives. And part of the problems that we've got here is if we think we've got an allocative efficiency problem, in that we've not got pathways, in particular, over the last, 15 years, the proportion of the health service budget that's gone on primary care, which Nick has just explained, is sort of really quite critical to unlocking better outcomes and efficiency. That's fallen from 11% to 9%. Yeah? And so, and you've got to look at the power structure also within this. And at the moment, if you're in a CCG, in an ICS, your GPs are all very, very disparate. Yeah, they're not organised at all. You've got a great big acute provider collaborative, which is arguably even more powerful than it was before because it's multiple and it's a complete monopoly. And then you've got a community of mental health trying to fight for a little bit, and social care somewhere over there. So it's not clear to me at the moment that we have unambiguously improved our ability to unlock allocative efficiency. And if you come back to kind of, bilateral monopolies, actually we've got two big beasts, and then, actually the things that really, really are what we want to transform, very disparate around the edges. It's not an obvious, sort of, basic economics is not an obvious way you design a market structure in order to be able to achieve allocative efficiency. So that worries me a lot. And then the second point was raised, what can we learn from the pandemic? For me, one of the things I've taken is very much this point about resilience, and we lack an output measure for something that's really, really important. And the parallel here is antimicrobial resistance and all the work that's been going on globally, where we need to incentivize people to invent new antibiotics with the aim of never using them. And so you do actually have to pay for things that you never use. There are some things which have existence value, and elements of emergency care, elements of maternity, for example, have an existence value beyond just their consumption value. And and especially when you have social objectives to reduce inequality and things like, and to ensure consistency of care even when, you know, populations are remote. And we're not going to compel people who live in, you know, deepest Cornwall to move in order to live somewhere where we can organise healthcare on a more straightforward basis. You know, that's not going to be policy. So actually, how we value resilience as an output, and it's very hard if you're not paying for an output, if you're not measuring. It's very hard there, and you see, and the NAO have just said for the new hospitals programme, the modelling for that is now building in occupancy rates of over 95% against the guidance that it should be more 85 to 87%, and NHS England saying to all ICSs we want you down at least 92%. Yeah, and they're doing that because they're not thinking about the act of stewardship and resilience, but just how to make the numbers add up at the moment for political reasons. So we do need, as economists, I'd argue, just as sort of Jim and others have tried to think through for antimicrobial resistance, how do we turn this into a market output? I think that's really important. And if Che could come up with how do we value resilience, that would be super. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We'll do our best. Thank you very much. Well, we're out of time now. Just like to thank all our speakers, both Martin from Che, but also Martin Campbell and Anita for coming today and taking their time to comment on some of our work. Really grateful for that. And thank you both online and in the room for your contributions. Thank you.